I'm glad you're back. I'm Mr. R, and this is the Rondinelli Project. And it's time for the moment of truth. The mold has set, and now I have to remove the clamps. And this is the moment of truth. You never really know how your cast is going to turn out until you get the mold separated. Part A and Part B. And that's what I'm going to do now. And I'm not going to speed this up because you have to be very careful about how you do this. So I take a screwdriver and I find a seam and I start prying open the seam and I move all the way around the mold. You have to be careful not to stick the screwdriver too far in because you could be damaging the fins or scratching the actual reproduction, the replica. Take your time, don't force this, and this mold here separated very easily. And that is the whole purpose of the PVA and the wax. What I'm doing here is I'm checking and inspecting the cast. I have one little imperfection right there, which I will fix later with epoxy sculpting material. Now, we've only got half the mold off. So now we have to get the rest of the fish replica out of the mold. I'm using a 1-inch putty knife and I'm breaking off the real thin pieces of fiberglass. I'm going to work all the way around. Hopefully this will release easily out of the mold. I find it's easier to release the fish from the mold by working from the tail towards the head. You gently want to work the putty knife underneath the fins and pry upward carefully. Work all the way around the cast and you'll feel it pop out. Don't force it. Some fish casts release very easily from the mold and others don't. The more bend a fish has, the more difficult the position is, the harder it is to get out. There you see it pop right off. And this one released very easily. I'm very pleased with how it released. A lot of times that's a struggle. I've actually had to break molds. Once you break the mold, you can't use it again, but this one can be used again. I'm inspecting the fish. There's some minor imperfections that we're going to have to repair, and that's part of the process. It's really not a big deal with the epoxy sculpt. This is what I use to trim the excess fiberglass resin and trim around the fins, and these are some of the attachments that I use. You don't need a respirator for this, but I really recommend a mask just to keep the fiberglass dust so you're not breathing that in. This makes a lot of dust, so you might want to do this in the garage, not indoors. Now for the beginner, I just want to stress that you can see the outline of the fins. So I'm going to trim off the excess. I'm not going to get real close to the fin, but I'm going to follow kind of the general outline shape. Just trimming it back, getting close to the edge of the fin. I'm going to work very carefully around the tail. These Dremel tools operate at high RPM, so they create a lot of vibration, and if it starts to chatter on that fiberglass, it'll crack, and it'll crack out a piece of the tail, the caudal fin, it'll crack off the dorsal fin or the anal fin, so you want to be really careful when you're working around the fins. Anyone that's ever used the Dremel knows what I'm talking about. For the beginner though, you want to be careful. You just follow the outline of the fin. You'll be able to see it, but stay back away. You don't have to get real close yet. You can always take away, but you can't add material once it's gone. Now this process creates an enormous amount of dust, so I have a little brush that I use to dust off the cast if it gets too much, so you can see what you're doing. Sometimes it creates so much dust you can't see what you're doing. You can't see the edge, the outline of the fins. So I'm going to continue down here very carefully, and I'm not speeding this up so you can see what I'm doing a little easier. Then I'll cut down the lower side here of the caudal fin. This is the whole reason we used the thickening material and the strength chop in the fin so that it gave it some thickness so that it wasn't so thin that it would crack away. Now, you don't want to get your fins too thick because they won't look real, but you can get them fairly thin and be very believable. I'm going to change bits here. I'm going to use a cutting wheel. I use that to create the spines, the sharp parts on the dorsal fin of the crappie and the anal fin of the crappie before you get to the soft tissue, the soft spines. But this is how you create the shape and get that look. And once again, lots and lots of vibration. I can't tell you the number of times I've been doing this and would just chip a big piece right out of the dorsal fin, and it just makes you sick because all the work you have to do into these. So take your time. I also use this to cut out the mouth. We're doing an open mouth, and that was the reason for putting the high fiber bedding in the mouth, because here now we have to have something to cut away so that the material wouldn't flow inside the mouth, and that's what I'm doing. I use a pencil to mark areas so I know not to cut beyond that area. I'm going to make a change here. I'm going to take the cutting wheel off and I'm going to put on my grinding stone that kind of comes to a point. And I'm going to start grinding out the inside of the mouth. And once again, you have to be careful. You just take your time. You take a little bit out at a time. Don't try to take too much or it'll grab and it'll cause your Dremel tool to run on you and it'll go where you don't want it to go. And that is a disaster. You certainly don't want it to go into your skin. I'm going to give you a little close-up here of the mouth to show you the detail that I'm starting to create. Now, I can teach you anything, but I can't learn it for you. You're just going to have to get your feet wet and dive right in and get your experience. I'm going to zoom in here and I'll show you what I mean by chatter. See how that's chattering? You want to be careful you don't break something off. I wanted to show that to you. And make sure you keep brushing off the excess powder that forms, and it goes everywhere. But I also use an emery board. I buy these, buy quite a few of them. They work great for sanding down and getting into hard areas. But I just want you to see, this is truly an art form. This is the art side of this. And you can see that the fins are starting to shape up now. Now we're going to turn our attention to the operculum, the gill opening. You have to remove all that fiberglass to create the opening, and I'll show you the finished product. Now it's ready for a gill to be put in there when we cast the fins. This fish replica art is like a chess game. You got to be thinking ahead. Here I am fitting the eye before we ever put the eyes in, but you have to do this now. And I keep checking, and once I get the right fit, I make sure that I put it in and that I get an exact fit. Once I have that exact fit and I'm happy with it, and I wasn't quite happy there, so we're gonna take away a little more material, but once the fit is perfect, I check up by putting the eye in, and I'll show this to you. And then I have two little bottles that I have marked for right and left. This is the right eye of the fish from the fish's perspective. And that way I don't get those mixed up, because even though they're supposed to be identical, the eyes are not necessarily identical. So I make sure each one is uniquely marked. That's the right eye. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the left eye. Once that's done, I'll do a test fit, and we will see exactly how that fits. And when I'm happy with how it fits, I'll remove it. There you can see it. That's the left eye. And I'll put that in a jar marked left eye. That way I know there's not going to be any mix up, and I'll have a perfect fit. Now, no, I'm not painting the fish, but what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take some white paint and I'm going to go over the seams and anywhere I think there's an imperfection. The reason I want to do this is once that dries, and this is acrylic, so it dries very quickly. Once that dries, it'll show me where all of the imperfections are and where I need to sand. Or, add material. That's where we would add our epoxy. And this isn't a perfect cast, and you very rarely get a perfect cast. You have to do some seam work all the time, and you have to add where material is missing, and you have to take away where things are too high. But it's all fixable. This is all minor stuff. I'm pretty pleased with this cast. It turned out very well. The fins are looking good. It has some minor imperfections, and this is the Apoxie Sculpt, the AB mix, which is what I'm going to show you right here. The white is the putty. The darker green is the setting material. You mix those together in equal amounts, and you have to mix those, even though I sped that up, for about 5 minutes. You can see the A and B, and I put those together. And you need to knead those, almost like dough, so you get a nice even color, and you do that for about 5 minutes. And that's why there's 2 different colors, so that you can see how the mix is going. But it has to be a nice even mix. You can add water to it, it'll soften it up. But what I do is I take just a little bit and I start putting it in where I need to add material or create something that's not there, such as chips out of the fiberglass that needs to be replaced when you're removing it from the mold. Just imperfections. Like here on the back, there was some little divots and I need to fill those in. Now, most fish have a bony structure called the basial on the floor of the mouth that superficially resembles a tongue, but it's really not a tongue. I'm a perfectionist, so it needs to be reproduced, and I use the epoxy to do that. You want to be accurate when you do fish replicas. Here I'm recreating the vent in front of the anal fin. Once your epoxy sets, which takes about 24 hours to be completely dry, you're ready for painting. And I'm very pleased with how this cast turned out. Once I get all of the sanding done, we will be ready to paint. I know, there's a lot to this, huh? You don't want to miss session 5, painting the cast. It's time to bring this Black Crappie to life. So stop back and see how this is done. Until next time, I'm Mr. R, and this is the Rondinelli Project. Don't forget to share this with everyone. I'll see you later. We gone.